have such globalization now that it's easy to have ideas spread much more quickly than in the past. But in the past, a lot of societies didn't change for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they were next to and interacting with other cultures that were different, but they chose to keep things the way they were. And I think at some point, when a society is stressed is when it really has to change. When you get stressed as a society, then you need to figure out what's going to alleviate this stress.
And as people.
Pardon me?
As people, when you will change, when your mind has so much tension built up that you are forced to make a critical decision, and that's when people change. I always tell my students when we do new ideas, this might make you feel really uncomfortable. When we read some of the stories that we're going to read and share some of the human experiences, but it's through that tension of the mind that you will make change. And that's when you grow.
But why are some people allowed to be brainwashed or allow themselves to be brainwashed? I just read a book thief about Hitler and the radical Muslims today. I mean, they allow themselves to be brainwashed.
Well, yeah, I don't know that you necessarily allow it. I think it's something that you're enculturated to think a certain way, and it's you could say the same. Why do the young girls of today have to have makeup? Why do they have to be so concerned about their looks? Why do they traumatize themselves with their self-image? Why do they torture themselves? And it's because our culture dictates that. It's just part of it. So we should watch a video. Let's see what Jean Auel has to say about her book. And Larry, you need to speak up, sir.
I know. We're awful quiet over there.
Listen, with all these women here, I haven't got a chance.
No. You can't do that.
Just use that.
One of the things you did bring up is religion. And religion is preventing a lot of things, a lot of changes.
Religion is certainly a powerful force.
I had the idea for the whole series by the time I was halfway through the first book. I knew how it was going to end. And yes, that knowledge was going to come into play.
Jean Auel's 6-part series, Earth Children, has a surprise ending that was more than 25 years in the making. And it's all about knowledge.
There's something that is learned, and it's going to change humanity from then on. And I thought about that when I was putting this together, and I thought, okay, there had to be a time before we knew this, and then what happened after we suddenly knew it? Once you open Pandora's box, it's over.
No spoiler alert here. I won't reveal the secret. But Auel's surprise ending shows that pushing the limits of knowledge is a universal human urge. How much we know, how fast we learn, even which information we have or don't have. These are all key to being successful in today's world. But was there a point in history where pushing those limits was actually key to our survival? Auel explores this question through her heroine, Ayla.
She was pushing the limits even with the Neanderthals because she taught herself to hunt, and she wasn't supposed to do that. And of course, then she had to pay the price, when she got punished.
Ayla was Cro-Magnon, one of the first modern humans. But her adopted family was Neanderthal, an earlier type of human. We used to think these two early versions of humans didn't overlap. But now we know they coexisted for 60,000 years. They often lived in the same areas, and sometimes in the same caves. But in the end, one group survived, and people wonder why. Some evidence suggests that Neanderthals were less likely to push the limits of their knowledge.
Their society, for a couple 100,000 years, it didn't really change.
But for Cro-Magnon, it was a different story.
We were still hunter-gatherers, but we were making stone tools then too. And in 50,000 years, we have not stayed static. We've sent rockets to the moon, you know? So that says there's got to be some significant difference.
Al speculates on the demise of Neanderthals by crafting a story about different types of intelligence. She proposes the idea of genetic memory for Neanderthals, with knowledge passed down over time unchanged. And she contrasts that with Cro-Magnon's adaptable experiential learning.
I wanted to come up with a difference, to show that there are two different kinds of people here. And not just superficially different, but really significantly different. And this is my own speculation, you know, because we don't know. So I said, okay, look at the shape of their head. There's a difference in the shape. There's a huge back of the head. And the back of the head, when I went looking for what does it have, there's a certain kind of memory that's in the back of the head.
Al's fiction builds on a fact. Neanderthals had much larger brains than we do, about 20% larger. So how come we survived and they didn't? Some experts believe that our smaller brain took less time to develop, meaning more energy can be devoted into maturing our bodies earlier. And that can mean having children sooner, and over time, a lot more of them.
I think in terms of the Neanderthal, they just didn't have as many children. But we don't know. We're still learning that.
So perhaps the Cro-Magnon won out over the Neanderthal by trading in a bigger brain for strength in numbers. Of course, we may never know.
If we do know something, then I try to follow within that. If we don't know it, then I'm free. You know, I mean, I'm gonna be logical. I'm not gonna put palm trees up on top of mountains, you know. And sometimes I just put it in there because it's fun. Because it makes for an interesting story. And I am, after all, writing a novel. And I think maybe that's partly what fiction can do for any kind of science, is it can bring it alive. I mean, in that sense, fiction can push the limits of science. I got a letter from one scientist who said, after reading my books, it sort of altered his perspective and his direction that he was going, because suddenly he had something else to think about. We pushed his limits too.
So, what's your reaction to this? Larry, speak up, sir. Put you on the spot here.
I think she just had a lot of fun. You know, writing this whole series. You know, she was a sponge for the knowledge of, you know, early men, and just had a gift for spinning the story, and just took her two bugs and put it together. Just enjoyed it. That's what I got out of.
I'm gonna tease you a little bit, Larry, and you too, Dave. When recently I read the Female Brain and the Male Brain series. I don't know if you've ever read that. Boy, is that interesting. I'm fascinated by the fact that Neanderthal, I've never heard it pronounced that way before. The Neanderthals had bigger brain, and that took a lot more time for the brain, and then with the smaller brain they were more able to procreate. How interesting.
You see that in the botany world, or botanists, and simple.
Really?
Well, grasses have reduced flowers. They don't. I mean, they have fruiting structures, but they're reduced. And grasses are everywhere on all 7 continents and reproduce.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
That
to
does
me.
make sense.
Okay, she mentioned in there that certain things we might know and certain things we don't know. What is she talking about when she says we don't know? Who is she referring to? Who is the we she's mentioning?
Scientific community. I mean, what you can prove and what you have faith is the belief. There's those concrete things that someone can find a fossil and say, this fossil proves that they had stone
tools,
Mhm.
this, those things you can find evidence of and proof. And then there's, well, what they've done with this, well, that has to be a little story together to come up with what you think or what you don't really know. They may have done this, but maybe not. Like she said, they may have just had more children than the others, and so that's where her story comes from. She took the facts that she did know and sort of put it together with how she wanted her story to go, and threw in things just for fun. So, you know.
I think the History Channel does that too, though.
They're not supposed to, but they do.
Well, if you watched The Story of Mankind on History Channel, that was, it reminded me of Gene Ault when I watched it. I couldn't help but look at the two.
Okay,
Was she one of the first to mention genetic memory as an author? Because can she explain it, or she doesn't have any, she's just guessing, but what does she mean by them having genetic memory?
that's a good question. What does she mean by that?
Wasn't she referring to the clan didn't have to teach their young a lot of things, they just automatically knew it. They remembered it through their genes as opposed to having mom and dad sit down and say, now this is fire, it's hot.
It would be
Yeah.
like in their DNA.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that the clan, in the original books, a lot of things that the clan knew, they didn't teach each other.
Mhm.
They were born knowing
Sort
it.
of like instinctive,
Yeah, right.
animal instinct.
And some of the clan had long memories, if you remember, and they
Right.
talked about the longer memory clan members. And I thought those were probably been your higher.
We're variable too, I lost my hearing a long time ago. So
Well, I think, that's the kind of thing that, as a scientist, you caution people about, because you don't really want people to think that, I could learn something and then my children will know what I learned because it's gonna pass along through my genes. That's not how it works.
Mhm.
So, we're all born completely a clean slate, and,
Not really.
you have to be-
Born,
Well, you have certain
traits, yeah.
certain instinctual things, but there's so much about your culture, and even
Oh,
tool
well,
making, and
that's
you
true.
know,
Right. Mhm.
you even have to learn about, we're just teaching one of my grandchildren about the idea that something is hot, or not hot, and so,
Because we're just getting into what brains are like and how their, synapses are
mhm.
working and so forth,
Yeah, and that's another, I think, important thing to think about in terms of how the technology is going to impact that. My grandchildren who are 3 and 5, or 1, 3, and 5, when they're playing with these instruments, what is that doing to their pathways? What kind of memory is that creating for them, and what kind of structure is that creating for them, so that, they may not be able to sit down and really concentrate for long periods of time, because they're so used to bouncing, from one to another.
Well, for example, the female brain is much more advanced in communication. And the reason for that is because we all start as women. And then the woman continues to develop, whereas the male then has to develop all the male traits. And so he leaves that communication to go do that other stuff in the development. And so the woman is farther ahead from birth with communication. And I just think that there's a lot to be said by the development of the brain and what Jean's talking about and where she's going with this.
So for future science reference,
Yeah.
the development and knowing about how brains develop,
Yes.
I could see where they will have new products and new applications for how our brain develops and how to develop that 5-year-old brain to have all the pathways that will make him or her. We talked about this in my class one time. If science gets to the point where when you're having a baby, they say, would you like your baby to have 150 IQ? And we can do it. Would you do it? And it was kind of a moral question. My students were very upset. They were like, well, and I said, well, no, we're talking about the future world. We're talking about science and, you know, would you do it? And it was quite a conversation.
Yeah, it's sort of like our world with our billionaires, the 0.1%. Would you want your child to be able to have that, be in that group, where they would have money, ease of life, and power over everybody?
I'm still
So
stuck,
that is
stuck
a
on the
very
point.
interesting
Why
question to
some
ask
people
students.
change and
It
other
is.
people don't.
Yeah, let's get back to that, because that's really good. I have a question about that I was thinking about, why some people change and some don't. Hunting and gathering groups, which were here in North America for thousands of years before, you know, the Europeans came and changed it all. And for, like, from 12,000 to 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, you had one style of hunting and gathering group, one. Archaeologically, anthropologically, we can only identify really one group called Paleo-Indians that hunted and gathered, and they didn't seem to change much at all in all that time. So, you know, why is that? And that would be the, you know, in this case, in terms of what we're talking about here, that would be the, you know, the descendants of
Well,
the Cro-Magnons.
I've read though that if it works, why change it? And since hunting and gathering, they were very successful working together in their tribes. So what would have been the tension or the need to change that? So I think as long as the groups were successful, change is not going to occur very rapidly at all, because they're very content and they're very satisfied.
What about competition?
I was gonna say, isn't there always that, you know, if you're successful, then your population's gonna grow, and your population grows, then you're gonna butt up against,
Right.
you know, somebody else, and then they're, you know.
Communication amongst the groups.
But I think that's why it probably didn't change for so long.
If there was enough space for everybody to coexist, but.
Well, yeah, you know, the infiltration into North America of Homo sapiens didn't occur until 20 or 25,000 years ago, or whenever, you know, whatever the most leading
And
theory is.
how long did
now.
it take them to populate? Was it 6,000 years from North America to?
Well, that's a question that we have a lot of evidence on that makes it seem as though it happened very quickly.
Mhm.
You know, and we have, you know, sites in South and Central America that are quite old. So it seems like they got down there fast, and then they just seemed to spread, and it seemed to, you know, there didn't seem to be any reason for change. And so you know, if that's the case, then I'm always confused, because everything that I had worked at one point, you know, and it didn't need changed. You know, my original telephone, you know, worked, or I could talk to the operator and say, connect me to somebody. But, you know, and it worked just as well as my cell phone does, you know, now, or my iPhone.
But
Yeah.
also, don't you think that teenagers, the next generation, they automatically want change because they don't want to be like their parents exactly. They want to be generation. They want to be unique.
Well, in our culture, that's probably true.
But that isn't true of past cultures.
Oh, it can't be. I mean, otherwise there would have been change all the time. I mean, you would have thousands of, you know, hundreds of generations going by with, you know, using the same stuff, treating things the same way. So that's, I get a little concerned that Ayla's so clever so much and is so accepted. You know, I agree with when you mentioned about religion. Religion is certainly one of the, and religion and magic and religion and spiritual world and religion and all that sort of, you know, coalesce together into one sort of topic, and all of that influences the society. When you don't understand things scientifically, you project some kind of understanding through, you know, whatever path you choose to take. So, you know, if it's against the common thinking, then it's, you know, it's a problem. It's like, you know, when Darwin decided, you know, that he, you know, finished finally his Origin of Species book, and, you know, it wasn't popular with the church. It was, you know, they were
When
still groups that were popular with that.
When I mentioned religion, I I also think of it in terms, for this type of conversation, I think of it in terms of power. That's another form of religion. You know, these priests create all these rules and they resist any change because it gives them control. And even the kings or the leaders of groups, and they for sure want to stymie the women. So that's very important.
Well,
That's because
in
they're stronger
Ayla's
than
world, you know,
That's the size of the
Yeah, well,
brain.
there's the other book, about the women of Tehran, and there were a bunch of women teachers that were free thinking. But the more that the men were getting brainwashed into this regime, and they couldn't fight it. So, you know, I'm just, that bothers me, that thinking, that group thinking, you know.
But if that's what you were raised with and that's all you know, that's why I always try to, like, when I, you know, even though I don't agree with a lot of, you know, that, but I always think to myself, if that's all you know and that's all you've known, how hard is that gonna be for them to change, you know?
and that's where social media has really fueled the fire.
Yeah,
I
like,
mean,
it-
it really has.
it is
because now
okay to be a little-
You can log in to people's blogs, it's, wow, this is how these people think, this is how they live, and, you know, it just fuels that, well, we want this for our women too. We want our daughters educated. You know, it's pretty powerful.
But with today, you can see the other side, you can see the result of, well, what would happen if women were more educated. So you can see another society. In the case of Ayla, she didn't necessarily see what would happen if she tried that. However, Jean Auld wrote the story in such a way that there were these crises and different things that happened to Ayla in her life that made her take that risk to go beyond. You know, she could have lived with the Klan forever, but things changed in her life. She was a little bit different, so she wanted different things. That was part of it. She didn't have the inherited memories, so she didn't understand all of that. It was different to her too, but then there were different things that happened to her in the story that forced her out of the Klan. And once you're out of the Klan, there's no other people, at least not in that area, so she had to learn to take care of herself. And that was sort of the start of that. And then she, you know, as the story progresses, she has these different life experiences that force her to take that risk. Whereas a society, if it's working, as you say, don't fix it if it's working, they didn't have any reason to take that risk to change because it's working. And you can't see across the river to somebody who's doing it differently and having success at that. So why would you take the risk? Because taking that risk could mean the difference between life and death. So you stay with the group what works, or what works kind of okay, until life gets to the point where you have to take that risk. Or someone in your group says, you know, there's got to be a different way, and they take that risk. And then they have to get people to follow them. And in today's society, although there are pockets that are not changing due to other power struggles, I think that you can see that, oh, well, that culture does it that way and it's working, so you might jump ship from one to the other. Or you might try to make those changes within your own group. But at that time where Ayla in the story is said, she makes a lot of the changes that she makes that are so rapid out of necessity. She goes and lives in the Valley of Horses all by herself. You know, you have to invent things to live by yourself. And that changed her personality and the way she was as a person. So then when she did start to encounter other people who were the same as she was, now she has people whose brains work similar to hers. She gets a couple other forward-thinking people who accept her, and the story progresses like that.
Something you're touching on there too is fear, because fear will often keep people from changing.
Very much.
Still does today. I'm
Yeah.
not trying that because I might fail, or I'm not trying that because I'm afraid of it.
or because somebody will kill you if you try to change.
Yeah,
And they're
but it's
successful,
like,
you
even
know.
in the library world, we've been so forced to move quickly and be ahead of everything, and same thing with education. To be that step before and be there for people to learn change. In there's the traditional librarian versus the forward-thinking librarian, and oftentimes the traditionalist is not embracing change because they're afraid of it, because they aren't trained in it, they don't know how to do it. So rather than to open themselves up to that.
I think there's more to it than that.
I think if you, I just finished the book before this one last week. And when Ayla tried to introduce, she was told to keep quiet about fire by her clan leader, by her cave leader. And they said, don't mention it until we get to the summer, and then each cave has their own leader. When Ayla introduced it to them, the leaders immediately said, we don't tell anybody about this. This is a secret. The people don't need to know this. It's something powerful that we can hold over them. And then one of the other leaders said, once they see that it's just stones hitting each other that makes fire, it's no longer a secret, and then where do we stand? So that leaders had to decide, do we let the people know about this, even though it's something that we could use as power over them? Or do we, as good leaders, share this power with the people? That was in the book just before this.
I'll have to go back and reread these. That's
But
one.
our country is
That's a
so
great point.
independent. I mean,
Great
that's
point.
what makes our country. We're independent thinkers. You know, I mean, hopefully our leaders don't tell us what we can do or not do. I mean, there's gotta be a point, you know, of civilization, but still you have your own choice.
Well, I don't want to get into that discussion too much because I would completely disagree with that in terms of us having choice. You know, I think our culture does a very good job of making us think we have choice, but in fact dictates to us, you know, through commercials and everything else, you know. Mary?
There's
Good to
versions
have you here.
of what she was talking about, yeah, I'm hiding because I came in late, of leaders keeping things. I mean, when you go back to the church in the Dark Ages, you know, nobody learns to read because then they might read that Bible for themselves, and they might think it says something different than we're telling them it says. And the internet, my golly, the federal government fought tooth and nail, the armed forces fought tooth and nail not to let the internet be available, not to let GPS be available,
I remember when it was.
because they wanted it for military purposes only. They didn't want the average person to have access to this. And, yeah, it was a long time that they were using it before you got to use
Have they
it.
invented now that we're not even aware of?
Exactly.
I mean, it's kind of scary.
It is, but it's, I think it's always that way. It's just at whatever level you're at of technology.
Okay, now take that conversation and go back to the beginning of man. How many times literally was the wheel invented? How many times was the bow and arrow invented before they were really passing it on to the next generation and the next
It's
generation?
just standard issue.
Or
Yeah.
did somebody did some very clever person invent this, whatever the tool is, keep it to themselves, and then it dies with that person, and then it has to be reinvented again, probably 100 times. You know, in my work in industry, we had to invent a tool to do something, you know, with molten metal, whatever it was, and I start talking with my peers in another factory in another company, and oh yeah, we had to do the same thing. You know, they had to invent the same thing. And
Well, and there's all kinds of cases of the major inventions of the world having been invented in 5 different countries at the same time.
Yeah.
Or
Because
around
the
same
time was right,
yeah.
and the materials were right, the knowledge had advanced about the same point in those places, and everybody figured it out.
Weather changes, you know, and you go back in history when all of a sudden it's not so warm anymore. So you start inventing other things, clothing, and how to sew your clothes together.
All right, we should look at the other video.
Good conversations.
I know.
It's fun.
It started with this black radish, which is a Spanish black radish, and worked its way all the way down.
They call it sleeve. Sleeve tattoos.
I'll be in the dining room and someone will ask me what a ramp is, and I have it on my arm. It's like, oh, this is what a ramp looks like. It's nice to have a built-in field guide reference map.
Chef Sean Brock has devoted his entire career and his left arm to stretching the limits of taste and texture.
You have to push and you have to experiment and you have to make that part of your daily life.
Sean, he's just a person that living in the past, living in the forward, living in the present. He's just all over the place, and that to me is what a creative, a leader is all about.
I'd much rather sell to a chef like Sean that knows what they're doing. It gives me a sense of satisfaction that they're in good hands of someone who knows what to do with all the fat and how to cure it.
It used to be, as a chef, our job was to make food taste delicious. And these days, it's much more than that. People are hungry for knowledge now, and people are hungry for answers.
And some of the most satisfying answers come from the knowledge that Sean has gathered from past generations.
When I was a kid, we were always stringing beans. You're sitting there with your grandmother and you're hearing stories of her childhood. You know, that's one of the beautiful things about food that inspired me to be a chef at a very, very, very young age. I just totally reminds me of black walnuts.
He brings with him that real organic sensibility of the Appalachian people. Hard scrabble, use what you've got, kind of people.
He cares so much about the understanding of food and how we honor it more than anyone I've ever met.
The wild goose beans that are being grown all over the South right now are from my grandmother's cabinet. They were in a little pill bottle. We went there after her funeral, and that was the first thing I grabbed was 2 or 3 varieties of seeds.
Like little jewels.
Seed saving isn't just about growing food. It's about knowledge, and it's about gaining wisdom, and it's about teaching, and it's about looking towards the future. I had those tattooed together because squash, beans, and corn form an agricultural technique invented by the Native Americans called 3 Sisters. We plant them all together, which we did in the field behind us.
Sean's knowledge of the past often leads him to new discoveries.
So one of the things that I noticed here is just how, resistant to any kind of disease this corn is.
Disease resistant and very, very tasty.
In the South, we eat a lot of grits and cornmeal and cornbread, and that comes from a dried corn that is milled and ground for flour.
The best tasting cornmeal and grits are going to come from corn that has been cold milled because heat dissipates flavor. You can read letters and journals and stories from the 18th century where people would talk about getting in fights at the mill over who was in line first because it was early in the morning and the mills were still cold. So we take those lessons learned and that knowledge and we say, okay, what can we do today? So when we mill grits, we put them in liquid nitrogen. email it, and put it on Twitter.
Using email and Twitter,
Let's see.
Sean shares what he learns and gets a little inspiration from one of his heroes. Well, okay, at least someone who's pretending to be.
I just started following Thomas Jefferson on Twitter today. I was so excited. I had no idea it was on Twitter.
Thomas Jefferson is one of Sean's favorite thinkers from the past because
he was never scared to experiment or push the boundaries, no matter how many people told him that he was silly or crazy and that what he was trying to do was impossible.
Those are 75% Guinea, 25% mule food. Like I said, these are oops pigs. John and I pretty much agree on everything. His philosophy is, as far as heritage breeds and pigs, is fatter the better, which suits me fine because that's the characteristic of the guinea hog.
maybe not as cuddly as a guinea pig, but the guinea hog is a whole lot meatier.
The American guinea hog has a really neat history. Thomas Jefferson even wrote about the guinea hogs and had a herd. The American guinea hog was built at a time when times were really hard. One nice thing about the guinea hog is they'll stay fat, and you can own just about anything. You can feed them scraps from the kitchen, grass clippings, whatever.
Staying fat meant they provided a lot of lard, an important commodity in early American industry. But in the mid-1900s, synthetic oils started to replace lard for mechanical uses, and Americans began to cook more with vegetable oils.